So today we have with us for our very first episode is Will Shannon, who is the executive director at St. Clair County Historical Society. And I have to mention as well, he's also the board president for the Illinois State Historical Society this year. So, Will, thank you for joining us.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
And so, as we talked before, the premise is just kind of basically I want to hear the stories of your county. I want to hear the wild stories, the crazy stories, the weird stories that people may not know about. And we're going to kind of, just talk about those stories and let people know what's going on in St. Clair County. So, what do you think is kind of maybe one of the, stories that people may not know from St. Clair County?
Well, one of the sort of big groups of stories has to do a lot with a couple of the towns right on the river. One of them being East St. Louis. I mean, at one point, East St. Louis was the fourth largest city in Illinois, and the stories kind of wrapped up in the history of East St. Louis is one of the things that makes the history of this area so interesting.
Hmm.
It being on a river, the river defines life here in a lot of ways, and defined life in East St. Louis. And all kinds of people came to a place like East St. Louis. There were people passing through, there were people who stayed, and everything from immigrants from Europe to African Americans coming from the South during the Great Migration. That's one of those stories that kind of sometimes gets passed over. But East St. Louis was an important place, not only economically, socially, and culturally too.
Hmm.
For a city its size, to have spawned, the careers of everybody from Miles Davis to Tina Turner,
Wow, yeah.
and to have a claim on being one of the birthplaces of rock and roll when Chuck Berry played at the Club Cosmopolitan in the early 1950s, and people talked about this wild new kind of music. And you read the articles about it, and it's like, no, this is rockabilly.
Yeah.
That's what they're talking about here. And that's another one of the claims to fame of the city of champions, as East St. Louis's nickname is. And I mean, also a place. One of the reasons it got the nickname the City of Champions is, it's the home to several Olympic gold medalists. I mean, most well known of them, Jackie Joyner Kersee.
Right.
She's an East St. Louis native, and her brother Al Joyner, he was an Olympic medalist as well. So, and she's still very involved in her hometown, and I will admit, when I met her the first time, I was a little starstruck. It
Oh, I
doesn't
bet.
happen to me
Yeah.
often, but it's like, wow, I remember watching her in the Olympics in, 1988 and in 1992,
That was
and
like,
now
yeah.
now I'm having lunch with her, and she is just one of the nicest people you could ever hope to meet. And her major in college was history.
Nice.
So, no, she was very interested in that. But no, the whole, and I mean, that could be, there have been scholars who've spent their whole career studying just that area. But one thing, the town of Brooklyn is a particularly fascinating one. It's a freedom village that
Hmm.
was started in the 1820s by a woman named Priscilla Baltimore, who led several families across the river from slave owning Missouri into Illinois and founded the village. And it has long been, a village run and populated by African Americans. And one of the things that I've been working on recently, and I know I worked on this with the folks from the State Museum, in their project about Route 66,
Hmm.
is the music clubs that were in Brooklyn. If you research anybody who was anybody played there, I mean, everybody from, Memphis Slim, Louis Jordan, Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, you name it, they probably played at the Harlem or the Plantation Club or one of the clubs in Brooklyn that were on Route 66. And that would have been a significant draw. But that's just one group of stories that it was a very it's a fascinating, and it's one of the things that got me really interested in this area's history when I moved here was that there's so much that comes together here.
Hmm.
It's kind of the history of the Midwest in miniature in one county. It's urban, it's rural, it's immigrant, migrant, it's native born. There's industry, there's agriculture, you can pull those strands out and just the fact that Cahokia Mounds,
Hmm.
which the site is actually split. Part of it's in Madison County, like Monk's Mound, which a lot of people are probably familiar with. That part is in Madison County, but the rest of the complex is in St. Clair. Of course, a division which would have been meaningless to the Mississippians
Right.
who originally populated the area when it was larger than London at the same time period.
Hmm.
Um, but there are only four UNESCO World Heritage Sites in the United States, and one of them is in Illinois. And I'll tell you, when I moved down here from the Chicago area 15 years ago, it was the first thing I wanted to visit. I hadn't unpacked all
Okay.
my boxes yet, and I got in the car and drove up to Cahokia Mounds because I had always wanted to see it. So
Hmm.
that's another one. And I'm glad that there's been movement to make it a national park, finally. I mean, because
Finally,
it
yes.
most certainly deserves to be one. And, kudos to the state of Illinois back in 1921 when they started buying the property
Hmm.
to preserve it, so that it didn't happen what happened to all the other Native American earthworks, which is they were bulldozed to build. I mean, you look at the city of St. Louis across the river. There's one remaining mound, and
Hmm.
that's it. That's it to ever know it was there. But yeah, I mean, you scratch the surface of that area, and so many fascinating stories come from it.
So with St. Clair County being, like I said, it's the oldest county in Illinois. That's the first county. So, I know in the upcoming year we're talking about, America 250 and, what was going on in Illinois at the time when Illinois really didn't exist, but St. Clair County existed 250 years ago. It might not have been a named county, but that area was existing, 250 years ago. So what have you seen with the history, I guess, pre-colonial history and dealing with, such a long stretch of history that most counties in our state don't have.
Yeah, and I mean it was the at the time of the American Revolution in the 1770s, there had been non-native, there had been European settlement in the area for 70 years.
Mm.
Because the area was originally inhabited by several of the tribes of the Illini Confederacy. That's who were lived the Tamaroa and the Cahokia and the Piankashaw. And when the first European settlement in the area was set up at Cahokia,
Hmm.
not to be confused with Cahokia Mountains. They're 9 miles away from each other. The village of Cahokia was established in 1699 as a Jesuit mission. And that ties this area into the whole network of New France at the time, because the French who came to settle in Cahokia and then later in Kaskaskia and on this side on the Illinois side of the river at least, they didn't come from France. They came from French speaking present day Canada. They were
Hmm.
Quebecois. And that's where a lot of them had their roots. So by the time of the American Revolution, there was a functioning municipal government in Cahokia and actually a quite a cosmopolitan population. Here again, it being a trading settlement on the river,
Mm-hmm.
All different sorts of people live there. In fact, um, the first black residents of the county were brought here as enslaved people in 1721,
Mm-hmm.
um, and lived in Cahokia. And so that was kind of the state of affairs. There were local courts. There was the French had even done censuses in Cahokia in the 1720s and 1730s,
Mm-hmm.
and we have maps of showing residences where people lived. The Cahokia Courthouse State Historic Site, the building that was
Mm-hmm.
eventually used as a courthouse, was built in 1740 by the Saucier family, and they would later go on to fight with George Rogers Clark during the American Revolution. In fact, if you look at the plaque we have here at our museum in Belleville of Revolutionary War veterans who are buried in the county, almost all of them are French.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that tells a story. You look at that, it's like, huh, I wonder all these people are French. Well, most of them came from Cahokia and Prairie du Pont, which is today Dupo, which
Mm-hmm.
just south of Cahokia. So that's where a lot of that comes from. But so, there was this active village life, but that was tied into wider networks
Mm-hmm.
in New France. Because, St. Louis isn't founded until 1764. New Orleans isn't founded until 1714. So, a lot of these settlements predate, places in the Mississippi Valley that
Mm-hmm.
would become the major settlements there, um, so yeah, that's another fascinating time in our history here locally. And plus, because of all the records that still survive, the Cahokia court records are a fascinating read, and a window into life during the time, if only to show us people sued each other about the same stuff they sue each other now. You took something that didn't belong to me. You promised you were going to do something and didn't.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple of things in there that read like bad Yelp reviews,
Oh, wow.
against one of the silversmiths in Cahokia. You said you were going to make this and it wasn't really good quality and you didn't give me my money back. And, um, it's those little kind of human connection things.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's a lot what was, in the 1770s, when George Rogers Clark comes to Cahokia in July of 1778, before the March to Vincennes. You don't usually have to tell French people twice, hey, you want to go shoot English people.
Well, yeah.
That's usually a pretty easy sell. So that's where, they call it, George Rogers Clark taking Cahokia, but I mean, he didn't really have to take too hard
Yeah.
because they were ready to go and they were on board with this new thing that was going to become the United States. So, and in fact, it was a lot of those folks that when the county was founded later in 1790, after the Northwest Ordinance was passed, it would be a lot of them, who would be the first county officials,
Mm-hmm.
the first judges, and things like that. It were these French families that lived in, and many of them still live in the area. Many of them, their descendants are still very much here. So yeah, that's a little snapshot of what was going on here at the time of the Revolutionary War.
So I know you were saying, there's a ton of records at Cahokia and, you know, census and stuff that, France did as part of New France. Is it, I don't want to say more difficult, but is that always a challenge, especially in a county like St. Clair County, that I know, like, when I was in school in history books, everything is kind of taught from that British perspective. The British came over and set up colonies. The British did this, and then we became America. And we don't really talk about New France that much, but they had such a huge part of developing what is now Illinois.
Oh yeah, no, and that does make the research not I mean, you just have to look different places because a lot of the the research, that I've done on it, and that's not my period of expertise, but in working in a county historical, we get questions about everything from soup to nuts. But those who have worked on this topic, a lot of the sources come from Canada.
Yeah.
Because that's where a lot of these folks came from, and the Jesuits that were here, their higher ups were in Quebec. So that's you'd be surprised how often I use the National Dictionary of Biography, written by the University of Laval in Quebec, because that's where a lot of these folks came from.
Hmm.
And so that, but yeah, the Revolutionary War in the West is often, overlooked. And right, it's taught a lot from the perspective of, the 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast and the British, and that doesn't tell the whole story, because it's that interior
Hmm.
that would become the old Northwest Territory. Once you get much further west of what would become Ohio, the pattern of settlement by Europeans was most certainly different.
Hmm.
And that goes especially for the Mississippi Valley. So no, I think it lends a good perspective to those who, just like you say, we learned about Lexington and Concord and Trenton and Washington crossing the Delaware and all of that stuff, and you should learn about that.
Yeah.
But you can't ignore that, especially looking at Illinois history, that it was being fought on a different front by different people, who were maybe enmeshed in kind of different networks. So no, it's interesting. It's different to research it. And I don't know if she's alive anymore, but shout out to my high school French teacher. I'm glad I learned French. I thought it was one of those things. It's like, oh no, when am I ever going to use
You're gonna use
this?
that. Yeah.
And it's like, wait a minute, you ended up, because my two languages are French and German, and those are very useful around here.
Yeah.
So those are both very, very useful. But no, it is a very different perspective than you may have encountered kind of in the master narrative of the American Revolution.
So, uh, when we talk about the history of St. Clair County, again, like we said at the beginning, um, looking for those great stories that people might not have heard about. Do you have a story or two in mind that you would like to share with
Oh
us?
boy. Sure, absolutely. You asked for weird, wild, and interesting.
Yeah.
And there's a couple that or surprising. And it here again, this spans the whole breadth of the county's history. One of the things, and I mean, I'll just walk into this by how I found out about it. When
Okay.
I started working on our collection here at the County Historical Society, 13 years ago when I started working here, I ran across, it was a U.S. Postal Service first day cover from National Airmail Day in 1938. And there was a graphic on there that said Belleville, home of the giant asparagus. And I said, okay, wait a minute. I need to know, because it was like a picture of a little guy with a giant spear of asparagus on his shoulder. And I said, okay, this has got to mean something. And it turns out this area became very famous for a different kind of asparagus than the green stuff that you're used to. And it was very common in Germany, and it was brought here by German immigrants. And it's white asparagus.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
imagine, yeah, it's yeah, or Spargel, der Spargel, if you're going to use the German term. And it became quite a big local thing. There was one farmer by the name of Charles Getz, who really heavily promoted this, and it became the hotels and restaurants around here served it. The asparagus harvest was a big thing every year. And in fact, Eckert's, here in Belleville still grows and serves it now. And yeah, if you don't like the green asparagus, it's imagine a milder version of that. And it's boy, that's great sautéed. It's great in soup. But yeah, I needed to find out what is this, what giant asparagus? And there was no one like colossal asparagus that was growing. I was kind of hoping for that actually, like a Jack and the Beanstalk kind of situation, but no, it was that was an interesting thing, and that's plays into the immigrants who came here and what they brought with them. And that's everything from that really redefines the area. That Belleville had, I mean, we had a brewery here as early as the 1820s because of the Germans who came here. It was Fleischwein, and I don't think it was any accident that it was right across the street from the courthouse. Was that's a great place to put a brewery. But and at one time before Prohibition, I mean, Belleville had five breweries operating here, and East St. Louis had just as many. So, that was quite a big thing, and only two of them survived Prohibition. But another interesting kind of, people sometimes like their history in firsts or the only example of something. We have here in the county the only town in the world named Marissa. And if you've ever known anybody named Marissa, I know I have a cousin named Marissa. It came from one of the early settlers of the area was a guy named James Wilson, and he settles in the area and eventually gets himself appointed postmaster.
Hmm.
And it's like, okay, there's a post office here. It needs a name. It can't just be the post office at James Wilson's house. So he pulled out his copy of the ancient classic, The Jewish Wars by Josephus.
Hmm.
And in there, Josephus talks about a town called Maharesha, which was sort of translated into the Greek as Marissa. And I guess he just liked the name of the word, liked the sound of the word, and decided to call this new town Marissa. And Marissa is it's in the southeast corner of the county. They have a lot of you can discover a lot of the county's mining heritage because there's a huge, not only in St. Clair but in all of southern Illinois.
Hmm.
There's a huge heritage of coal mining. And yeah, if you go visit our friends down at the Marissa Historical Society, they have some great displays about coal mining in the
Hmm.
area. And that was, I mean, how do you think you get towns with names like Glen Carbon and Carbondale
Hmm.
if you don't have a lot of coal production in the area? So that's one of the things that helped grow this area was when, whoa, okay, it's going to be an advantage to you to um, you know, to uh, to have coal, and
Hmm.
and that spawns so many other things in not only our area's history but the county's history that plays into labor history, the developmental unions, and all of that. But so you see, you can take these little, and I this is what I try to do with our publications with social media that we do for our organization
Hmm.
is take these little interesting stories and then you can spin them out
Yeah.
into okay, the interesting story kind of grabs your attention,
Hmm.
and then it's like there are larger implications to this, like okay, another great one. Okay, we're going way forward in history. I was alive when this happened, but one of the first places on radio that the song Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang, which is
Oh,
considered
yeah.
one of the first rap songs, was played on a radio station in East St. Louis in 1979.
Wow.
Um, the story goes, and it was WESL radio, and the guy who was the station manager was a guy known as Gentleman Jim Gates, and a radio station manager gets a lot of records. And he said he tried to listen to most of them, and he put that record on, and it was like nothing he had really ever heard before. And he hands it to one of his DJs, whose name was Edie B. Anderson, and Edie Anderson, she's still around,
Hmm.
and she remembers listening to it, and she didn't like it. But Jim Gates said, "Well, I'm the station manager, and I think people are going to like this." And they put it on, and they could not stop the phone from ringing after they played it. And later they had another famous DJ who was known as Dr. Jockenstein operating on your mind
Hmm.
in East St. Louis. And so that was one of the first places, not only in the St. Louis market, but probably beyond, that someone was willing to take a chance on this emerging kind of music. And to hear, and you can find online the people who were involved with the station telling their oral histories. And
Hmm.
it was just would have been a really exciting time to be in music and in radio. And you can just imagine, turning the radio on and hearing, like those folks who heard Chuck Berry in the
Yeah.
early 50s. It would have been, oh my, what is this? This is crazy. I've never heard anything like this before. But yeah, it's those little stories, and the Chuck Berry story is another one. I mean, it was New Year's Eve, 1953,
Hmm.
and there was a local band. Their guitarist was sick. He was in the hospital, and someone suggested, "Hey, there's this really great guitar player who lives over in St. Louis. His name's Chuck Berry, and he's just getting started and probably isn't playing a gig tonight."
Hmm.
So they call him, and Chuck Berry, he takes the trip over the river to the Club Cosmopolitan at 16th and Bond Avenue in East St. Louis, and plays with this band. And the owner of the club likes it so much that they kind of get a residency there. They play there for a while until 1955 comes around, and the band wants to record. And that's when they pack everything up. They drive up to Chicago to a little studio called Chess Records,
Hmm.
which I believe is at 47th and Cottage Grove in Chicago, and meet Phil and Leonard Chess, and record a little song called Maybelline. And then and here again, changing music forever. And if later on, the movie that was made called Hail Hail Rock and Roll, which came out in the 1980s,
Hmm.
part of it was filmed at the Club Cosmopolitan right before it was demolished.
Oh, wow.
Um, yeah, because it was a bar forever, and they kind of spruced it up a little bit to film the parts of that. So Chuck Berry played it at the Club Cosmo one final time, and you can see it on film,
Hmm.
in the movie Hail Hail Rock and Roll. But you can see how you can take these interesting little tidbit stories and turn, and this is how, and this is I this I, it's and I love stories like this, because it's the way to get at those people who say, "Oh, I hate history, it was my worst class in school, I never liked it." It's like, well, you probably are interested in history, but you just don't know it, or it's not in the way that you were taught it,
Hmm.
or in the way, because it benefits from having a good teacher. And I know I benefited in my life from having some great history teachers,
Hmm.
and in high school and in college, and but it all comes from that. And who knows who could be listening to this podcast right now, and one of these stories grabs you,
Hmm.
and causes an interest. And that's what I think when we give school tours at our museums. For which of these fourth graders is this going to be the day that sticks with you, and you become interested in this for the rest of your life? Because I know I can point at a couple of moments like that for myself, and that's around the age I would have been. I probably would have been around 10. Um, going to the Museum of Science and Industry and the Art Institute in Chicago, and thinking, boy, wouldn't it be great to work or to have something to do with this for the
Hmm.
red for
Hmm.
wouldn't, and that thought never completely left my mind. But another great one about St. Clair County. and this was about, speaking of bad reviews. We got an extraordinarily bad review from none other than Charles Dickens.
Oh no.
Um, Charles Dickens, he was writing his book about when he was taking his trip through America that he originally eventually, writes a book about.
Hmm.
In 1842, he comes through St. Louis and he wanted to come over to Illinois because he had read a lot about prairies, about American prairies, and how important that was, and he wanted to see a real American prairie.
Hmm.
Um, and he comes to Belleville first. He was actually on his way out to Lebanon, which is, that's where McKendree University is. It's a town east of here. Um, and boy, he did not have one single nice thing to say about Belleville. He said the streets were like an open pigsty. He said the people were drunk and rude. He went to a show by a magician named Dr. Crocus, who he found utterly unconvincing. And then he eventually leaves and goes on to Lebanon, which he liked actually. He compared Lebanon to English country towns, and at the inn that he stayed in is still there, the Mermaid House, which is another local historic site. You can still visit it today. It was built in the 1830s, and he really kind of liked Lebanon, and then he moved on. If you know the backstory, he had just figured out that he wasn't going to get paid as much by his publisher as he thought he was. So he was already in a bad mood when he
Oh
showed
yeah.
up. And
Yeah.
the editors of our local papers basically turned it right back around on him and said, "Well, hey, we're not too fond of you either, Chuck." And eventually, years down the road, in 1911, his grandson visits the area
Hmm.
and issues a formal apology and
Nice.
says, "My grandfather was probably in a bad mood. He probably said some things he didn't mean."
Hmm.
It's and there are great pictures of his grandson at the Mermaid House where he would have stayed. And but yeah, we definitely did got 1 star, would not recommend from Charles Dickens. But understood, it's like, okay, if I found out that I'm wandering through this country I've never been through before, and I'm not going to get paid as much as I thought I was going to,
Yeah.
I might be in a little bit of a bad mood too. But he was, and going a magician, Dr. Crocus, like, what did you expect that to be? It doesn't, kind of rolling your dice and taking your chances there. I don't know, but so that's one of the famous names that passed through the area who was most certainly not impressed.
It just in listening to these stories, it seems like especially East St. Louis has such a like a rich history that I'm I guess I would say I'm kind of surprised there's not like there hasn't been just a like a musician's history of East St. Louis, in some kind of book form or documentary or something like that to
and
really
and
look
there
at that.
have been things like that, and there's, since 2018, there's been an East St. Louis Historical Society who's working hard on preserving and promoting a lot of that history, and
Mhm.
I'm humbled and proud to be involved with that to be a board member of that organization. And you can find, I mean, the probably the best one volume introduction to the city's history is called Made in the USA. It was written by a friend and colleague of mine named Andrew
Mhm.
Theising. He was a professor at SIU Edwardsville, and he spent his most of his academic career. He was actually a political scientist by training,
Mhm.
studying things like urban planning, but was very interested in East St. Louis and wrote quite a bit about it. And his work, and there's been quite a lot of academic work done, especially in the past 20 years, on the race massacre in East St. Louis in
Mhm.
1917, which is one of the, I mean, it's an event with national implications that happens right here
Mhm.
in the summer of 1917. that it leads to the founding of the National Urban League. It's the St. Louis chapter of the NAACP is everyone from Teddy Roosevelt to Marcus Garvey to Ida B. Wells. Right, and Ida B. Wells comes here to East St. Louis to inspect and get at the horrific conditions of what had happened after the riots. And but so there's been a lot of, but it's sort of, I don't want to like episodic. There's a lot that's been done, and a lot of that work kind of sets the political scene.
Hmm.
Like Charles Lumpkin's book American Pogrom. It just doesn't talk about the race massacre. It talks about East St. Louis in the early 20th century and kind of how it had gotten there and putting it in its context before looking at the events. And that's what what Professor Theising's book does too. Um, but yeah, it is very fertile ground. And there's also been several works done that I like, biographical dictionaries that
Hmm.
have been published of famous and noteworthy East St. Louisans. That includes everybody from, and I can't believe I didn't mention yet, Miles Davis. I mean, he was born in Alton, grew up in East St. Louis,
Hmm.
and the his boyhood home is open. It's a museum and cultural center at 17th and Kansas Avenue. And talk about a place that you get chills,
Oh, yeah.
knowing standing in the room where Miles Davis got his first trumpet from his dad
Hmm.
when he was in junior high. That, and having been a lifelong fan of Miles Davis's music, it's like here's where it started.
Hmm.
And that's one of those with East St. Louis and with other places too, of course. That's the power of place right there. Is you can read volume after volume after volume, but you will gain another insight
Hmm.
when you're in the place where these events occurred. And that's why preserving historic places is so important. I mean, and why those places are meaningful. But no, East St. Louis is, and tell you, it is a community that is knowledgeable about and proud of its history.
Hmm.
And proud of its resilience, because East St. Louis has been through a lot. The people who made its history, and that's what the East St. Louis Historical Society tries to do, is to show all the fascinating story that comes from that starts on the banks of the Mississippi and reaches out all over the country and around the world in some way. When you get people like Miles Davis, that's but no, there's always more to be done. There's always more to be done. Like I remember one of my professors telling in graduate school saying that research, it's like a pie eating contest where the grand prize is more pie.
Yeah.
It kind of builds on itself, but I'm glad to see a lot more activity and interest, and that's what organizations like ours here locally and the State Historical Society, that's the core of our mission,
Yep.
is to show people these stories aren't remote. They're not dead kings and battles. This is your story. This
Hmm.
is our story. And it has good parts, it has bad parts, it has joyful parts, it has horrifying parts, but it's all our story.
Hmm.
And the what we can do to preserve and tell it is, it helps make us who we are. But no, East St. Louis, it's a fascinating case of that, and very much worthy of further study.
Hmm. You mentioned uh the race massacre in 1917. How has that really affected the storytelling of the history of St. Clair County?
Um, for a long time, kind of the master narrative here again of the county's history, for a long time, it was all but ignored by predominantly white historians,
Mm-hmm.
who would, that's not a story that was often told, or if it was, it's one of those, it was briefly mentioned, that there were riots and there was some destruction, and they don't get into the causes or anything like that.
Yeah, of course not.
Um, but for Black East St. Louisans, it is an event that still is close in people's memories.
Hmm.
It redefined a community and how it thinks about itself. And it's one of those seismic moments that you can't, it's and because to me as a historian looking at it, it's like, how could you even think of telling the history of this place without talking about that?
Right. Yeah.
You can't ignore that. It was a lot led up to it, and a lot happened because of it.
Hmm.
And the it's the what leads up to it. I mean, that's more than we can get into here. But
Right.
it's a labor dispute. It's racist practices on the part of employers and labor unions, and
Hmm.
the growing power of black citizens in the political arena in the area at the time. And but yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways it was either glossed over or given very superficial treatment,
Hmm.
which to me is not only does further violence to those who suffered violence in 1917. It's historical malpractice as
Yeah.
far as I'm concerned. If to ignore something like that,
Yeah.
love it, don't love it. That's not, no. You have to confront that legacy,
Hmm.
and it's not easy. It's not easy, and it's not easy working with history like that, because as I said to some of my East St. Louis friends and colleagues, it's like, look, I know, I look like the problem in some ways. It was Irish people largely who were, populated the East St. Louis Police Department at the time.
Hmm.
So yeah, and I realize there's a trust issue there, because it's one thing that has been done to marginalized communities is to rob them of their history.
Hmm.
Because if you can convince somebody that they don't have a history, it's an easy step to convince them they don't have a future.
Right.
So that, and doing that work and doing that difficult work is part of what value historians bring with the analysis that we do,
Hmm.
is that we're willing to confront, and we're looking for the truth no matter where it leads us. And to be open-minded, and to know that you're going to go places you might not want to go, but um well, let's say you might not end up where you're going, but you end up where you need to be,
Hmm.
hopefully. But yeah, that's what changes. And it's great that there are efforts currently on to collect survivor narratives
Hmm.
from the riots, and to get those down from stories that had been passed down in families for generations. I mean, those families who stayed in East St. Louis, and those black families who fled and went across the river to East St. Louis and never came back.
Yeah.
And including the family of famed singer and entertainer Josephine Baker. I mean, her family lived and left during the riots,
Hmm.
and never to return. And but yeah, it's just one of those things that to someone doing history now, it's unfathomable that you wouldn't talk about. It's like, how could you tell the story of this place and not talk about that?
Exactly.
Um, and that's the same with race riots. I'll bet if you look anywhere. I mean, Springfield in 1908,
Springfield.
Chicago in 1919, Tulsa in 1921. That's it's part of the conscious forgetting on the part of some people,
Hmm.
because it's too painful to deal with, or they don't want to deal with it, or they agreed with what happened. And that's so, but no, that is our job. And in working with East, because that's kind of how I got involved with what would become the East St. Louis Historical Society, were the commemorations in 2017. for the centennial of the race massacre that was done back 8 years ago now. So, but no, that it really it is the that period. I think in a lot of the work that's going on now is starting to take on the gravity it always should have had.
Hmm.
And being led by African American historians, members of the community in East St. Louis, who are putting this narrative into the light that it should have always been in. So,
Hmm. So moving on from, I guess, the real history and the serious history and,
mhm.
sometimes the uncomfortable history, have there been any, I want to say myths that people believe about that area of St. Clair County that you're always having to dispel? Is there like, oh yeah, people always think that, Bigfoot lived here, but Bigfoot was never here.
Oh my gosh. Of course, there are history and folklore at their best can inform each other, but we
Mhm.
must know that they're different things.
Yeah.
And oh boy, apart from, what every Illinois community goes through with Abraham Lincoln popping up in places where he wasn't,
Yeah.
um, that if he tried a case at every courthouse they said he did, he would have been trying cases morning, night, and noon for the whole of his life.
Yeah.
So, and keeping people to the three confirmed we know times he visited here. And there you go. He had a lot of friends who lived here. He had a lot of
Hmm.
political allies, especially German ones, who lived here in southwestern Illinois. People like Gustav Kerner and Friedrich Hecker, who helped bring together the German vote for that new thing called the Republican Party in the
Hmm.
1850s. But no, those are ones we're having to dispel a lot. Um, Misnaming of places. There was a historian who I think made up the first name of Belleville. He said, "Oh, it was Compton Hill." It's like Compton Hill's a neighborhood in St. Louis.
Yeah.
So I don't really know. Well, if you know how those 19th century histories were put together, they were interviews with people and they didn't really check their facts after them.
Yeah.
So kind of what people said got published, and once it ends up in on paper, then you're going to have trouble getting rid of it. So we still, oh, did you know the original name of Belleville was Compton Hill? It's like, no, it wasn't. Mm-mm. No, Belleville actually has a birth certificate. They moved the county seat to Belleville from Cahokia on March 10th, 1814. There it is in the county board minute book when they made the decision to do it. And there's no fanciful history behind the name. There's been stories about that. Oh, Belleville, women named Bell, and this and that. It's like, no, George Blair, the guy who sold the land to the county, they said, okay, you get to name the town. And he liked the sound of the word. There you go.
That's
Nothing
all it
nothing
is.
bigger than that. It's French for beautiful city. So it's a nice sounding name and everything, but and it has nothing, that's also confusing. It has nothing to do with the French people who lived here. In fact, they were moving the county seat to get away from them. So, when they were doing that. But and we have our share of of local folklore. With things like the Underground Railroad, it's always hard to prove
Hmm.
sites that were on that because these folks were involved in clandestine activity. So
Yeah.
it's not exactly something you'd be keeping notes about, but
No.
but part of that and this dispelling, I mean, it's not just me wanting to ruin things for people,
Oh,
but
yeah.
it's part of our educational mission.
Hmm.
It's part and also thinking about how is it that these stories grow up and how is it that they get legs and that people start to believe them. So it's part of their understanding of things as much as the facts are. And But no, so those are two of them. There's um the we do a haunted walking tour every year of the historic district where it's a ton of fun. We draw the bright line though between here's what we know about the local history, here's what people say they've experienced. And what,
Yeah.
what I tell people about that is, I'm a historian. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a philosopher. That's above my pay grade. Okay.
Yeah.
That's not my I'm here to get you the historical background, and then what you want to believe beyond that is really up to you. So and it's things people have experienced. I've been in all these places for years now and never experienced anything. So that will tell you one of two things. Either there's actually nothing there, or there is something there, but it for some reason doesn't want anything to do with me.
Yeah.
So
Either way,
I don't
that's a
know. Maybe
win-win.
doesn't like people with, blue eyes, or I don't know, whatever. It doesn't like the smell of my aftershave, whatever it is. But no, so and every local historical organization and can probably point to a couple of examples of, boy, here's stuff we hear all the time that
Yeah.
just isn't true.
Hmm.
And that there's just no factual basis for. And and here again, the bigger the claim, it's, let's steal the line from Carl Sagan that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. So, if you're going to make a big, you better have some really convincing evidence.
Yeah.
Um, and there's some story about Abraham Lincoln getting kidnapped and was in Lebanon, and they took him to Carlisle, and he's never been to either of those places. And, this is something, I mean, if there's an American whose life has been extensively studied, Abraham Lincoln would be that person. And
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, it's, I mean, you just look at a scholarly exercise like Lincoln Day by Day.
Hmm.
Where we have a pretty good idea of what the guy was up to most days of his adult life.
Yeah.
So, the getting kidnapped in Clinton County, and it's like, boy, this would have shown up somewhere,
You would have think
you
that would
know.
have been mentioned in someone's diary.
I mean, and there's enough interesting stories about him that you don't need to make anything up.
No.
I mean, the story about him almost fighting a duel, that's absolutely real.
Yeah.
That's absolutely, and the guy he was going to fight against was a St. Clair County guy named James Shields, who eventually ends up being involved in state government, and the two kind of make up with each other. And that's another one. The location of where that duel was supposed to be has
Ooh.
moved all has moved all over the up and down the river, everywhere for, but no, there's enough. And isn't that the thing about history? There's enough that's interesting, and it really happened.
Hmm.
And I'm not knocking folklore. Folklore is a way of
No.
knowing, it's a way of understanding, but you got to understand the basis behind it, and we deal with that a lot in local history. And you can have an appreciation for both as long as you, like I said, draw that bright line.
Yeah. Speaking of, we do need to do a historical marker for James Shield on that island in the river for the duel.
That would, yeah, because that was, and oh geez, that was another thing. There was one of the local Masonic lodges claimed that they had the sword. And of course, it was not even close to the descriptions that we have of the
Mm.
cavalry sabers that were used. And where would they have gotten it from here? And it turns out it was a local newspaper editor who made up the story, just made it up. And because it
I,
turns out he made up a lot of stuff.
yeah.
And yeah.
I know that there's I think when we took that bus trip to St. Louis area and we went to the Missouri Civil War Museum, they had a
Hmm.
display talking about the Lincoln Shields duel, and they had a
There
sword
is.
there, but I think they said that one's a replica of what the cavalry sword would look like that he used.
Yeah, exactly. And that it's similar to the ones that were described.
Hmm.
And it's like, okay, that's to me that's okay. I mean, it's like okay, we don't have the actual thing, but if you want to picture what it was they were using
Mhm.
and
This
how
is
a
it.
tall guy like Lincoln and a short guy like James Shields
Hmm.
would have, that duel, it wouldn't have gone great for Shields. That's all I'm
No.
thinking. If it would not have, gone real well. Luckily cooler heads prevailed and talked him out of actually
Hmm.
doing it. Um, but yeah, so I think that's a good teaching tool here again, but it's clearly labeled. This is a similar model to the ones that were described and the ones that we know that they maybe got from the armory.
Hmm.
Um, because I think and I know there's a connection to Jacksonville in that story, but right. But that was no, that but no swords. It's like pieces of the true cross, and everyone. I hate bursting people's bubbles, but I gotta tell you the truth about what you've got. So,
Yeah, exactly. So, alrighty, well, we've been at this almost an hour, so I'm gonna wrap this up. Is there any last things you want to tell us about what St. Clair County Historical Society is doing, what they're planning on the next couple of months that you want to highlight?
well, yeah, our organization, we're finishing up our program planning for US 250th. We've got a couple of things underway. We're going to do reading of the Declaration of Independence at the Old Cahokia Courthouse on July 8th, along with our local chapters of the Sons of the American Revolution. And I know that's a nationwide thing, doing readings on the 8th, the day
Hmm.
that it was first proclaimed to the public. I know we're planning a special programming series with guest speakers here in town, both at our museum and at a couple of different locations. And we're looking to bring back something we had done for years and then stopped during COVID, which was a countywide museum open house day,
Oh, wow.
where all the museums and historic sites are open with special programming on the same day. And at one point we drew sizable crowds with that. But then of course with COVID, we had to, that kind of stopped. But and we're all promising ourselves this. We're going to bring it back for 1 year.
Hmm.
But we'll see what we get talked into after that. And that's everything from workshops to special exhibits to demonstrations to, we had the vintage baseball teams played a game, and the everything, demonstrating everything from rope making to blacksmithing to, and it was really a lot of fun. And I was so glad when we did that to see how many kids showed up,
Hmm.
and we're having that aha moment that I was mentioning earlier that kind of sparks that interest. So yeah, and then we have our regular events, our spring historical fashion show, our candlelight historic homes tour, which we just finished this past weekend, the 30th edition of. And we hope to bring a US 250th flavor to all of those things. So we've got quite a lot on, and our organization this past year just celebrated its 120th anniversary. We're looking back at what we've done. To use current terminology, the what and the how have changed, but the why we do what we do has been the same for 120 years and will be the same. So, but yeah, our founders, they might have kind of cocked their heads a little bit at the haunted walking tour or our glow bingo nights,
Hmm.
but it was all done in service of the cause. So yeah, it's going to be an exciting year for us, and I know for the State Historical Society too. So watch this space.
Exactly. And how can people get a hold of you? They want to find out more information about St. Clair County.
They can visit our website, stcchs.org. They can email me, stcchs.curator@gmail.com, or you can give us a call at area code 618-234-0600. And we're also active. You can look us up, find us on Facebook and on X.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. This was a
Oh,
great conversation, and I hope everybody's going to learn a little something from it.
great. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And yeah, like I said, keep scratching the surface. You never know what you're going to find when you study history. So